Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Cycle 25 discussions, our group that is a club without being a club, our online place to be for ham radio. And I am lucky today because I have Mark Smith, Smitty Halbert, with us, and he is a bit of an authority on this thing called Mastodon, which I know like darn near nothing about. So before I let him protest about that, I'm going to switch over to him, and he will be able to brief us on what we need to know about Mastodon. This is very timely because of some other events going on in the world.
Yeah.
So you may want to, let's just take it away, Mark, and we'll get straight into it.
All right. Sounds good. First off, I do want to point out that amongst the blind, the one-eyed man is king. I do not claim to be an authority like on a global scale, but I probably do know more than the average ham. So we'll limit the scope of my authority to that. First off, introduction. Hi, my name is Mark, also known as Smitty or Smitty Halibut. I'm a host on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. And I have been a Unix admin and network admin for nearly 30 years now. So one of my hobbies is that I run servers on the internet. I run my own email server and that sort of thing. And so when recent events started up, this presentation is not going to be about those recent events. Go look at what happened in social networking around the middle of November of 2022, and go look at the news sites and you'll see what's happened. But the short answer is that a lot of people have been looking for new social media platforms. And one of the social media platforms that's been coming up a lot is commonly referred to as Mastodon, and I will get into later why that's probably a bit of a misnomer. It's more accurate to call it the Fediverse, and I'll get into the details on that in a little bit. But so if you hear me use the terms Mastodon and or Fediverse, for the time being, you can consider those to be synonymous, and I will explain the distinction to them later. But the more correct term when people say, oh, I'm on Mastodon now, the more correct way of describing that is to say, I'm on Fediverse now. So we'll look into those distinctions in a bit. So anyway, I started up my own Fediverse server, which actually is a Mastodon server, and got into it pretty early from a 2022 standpoint. And so when back in May, and then so when the November events started happening, I was already there and established and had a lot of experience under my belt and have kind of been shepherding a lot of other people into the Fediverse. So what the heck is Mastodon? Let's start there. Everyone's been throwing the word around and trying to understand what it is. It is a social media platform that looks and feels a lot like Twitter. And so if you are looking for an alternative to Twitter, for whatever reason that might be, go look at the news. Mastodon and the Fediverse is a good alternative to that. And it looks and feels very similar to it. It has the same mechanisms. And those mechanisms like, you post a little short blurb, and people who are following you will see that post. Similarly, if you follow other people and they post something publicly, you will see their posts in your timeline, in your home timeline. And I'll make a distinction on what the different timelines are in a bit. But the home timeline in Mastodon feels very much like Twitter. But the important distinction is that Twitter is a single domain. It is a single instance. It is a global namespace. That is to say that my identity in Twitter is Smitty Halibut. That's it. It's just a single identity. It's a username. On the Fediverse, the reason it's called the Fediverse is because it is a federated system. Federated meaning I run my instance over here, you run your instance over here, or you use a community instance of different software packages, and Mastodon is one of those software packages. That's the distinction. Mastodon is the name of the software. The Fediverse is the name of the network of all of these software. And there are other software packages besides Mastodon. But I can be on my instance, you can be on your instance, and a third person can be on this community instance. And our identity is username at instance name. And that is your whole identity. And another person can be a different username at this different instance, and a third person could be a different username at this instance. Or they could be the same username on a different instance, and that is an entirely different identity. So Mark at Halibut is different than Mark at mastodon.social or whatever, right? Just because the usernames are the same, because they are at different domains, those are totally different identities. Think of it like email. And the reason you think of it like email is because email is a federated system. I run my own mail server at halibut.com, right? So my email address is smitty@halibut.com or mark@halibut.com. But just because I'm on my own server, I can still email somebody at gmail.com, even though we're on different mail servers. And that's because it's a federated system. So anything I do to my mail server and whatever that other person does to their mail server, the servers talk to each other on the back end. That's why your identity is username at server name, so that my server knows where to go to talk to the user on the other server, right? Mastodon and Fediverse are doing the exact same thing. My identity on the Fediverse is smitty@halibut.com. And so I talk to my halibut.com server, and I'm going to pull an example out of the air. KJ6VU, George, is KJ6VU at mastodon.radio, which is a different instance run by a different person. And George and I can follow each other, even though we're on different instances. You can't do that with Twitter. To follow somebody on Twitter, you have to be a user on Twitter. There is no, I can't follow Smitty Halibut at Twitter from, such and such at Facebook, right? Those two servers don't talk to each other on the back end. So what is Mastodon? Mastodon is the server software. It's the name of the software that we are running that does the Twitter look and feel. Fediverse is the network of all of these servers, right? And then the protocol that they all talk on the back end is called ActivityPub. It's very similar. It's analogous to SMTP for email. If you've heard the phrase SMTP, that's the actual protocol that all of the servers on the back end on email talk to each other. That's how my server and Gmail exchange emails back and forth. In the Fediverse, that protocol is called ActivityPub. But just like we don't hear the phrase SMTP very often in regards to email, we're not going to be hearing ActivityPub very often in regards to our presence on the Fediverse. There are other software packages besides Mastodon that are on the Fediverse. They talk ActivityPub, but they look like other things. One example is a package called PixelFed. It is an Instagram look-alike, right? It looks and feels very much like Instagram. You post a picture and then you can put some little text and caption to it, and you can follow people, and they do stories with automatic disappearing things. And like the look and feel is very Instagram-y. But because it talks ActivityPub, I, on my Mastodon server, can follow somebody on a PixelFed server. So their PixelFed content will show up in my Mastodon timeline. That's something you don't see on the private systems. There is no interoperability between all of these private systems. There is when you start talking about the Fediverse. And that's why I make the distinction between Mastodon and Fediverse. Mastodon is one software package that can connect to the Fediverse. But since it is Twitter that we are primarily talking about migrating away from, Mastodon is the one software package that is getting all of the attention. So that's just the clarification between what's the difference between Mastodon and Fediverse. Why do I keep saying we're going to join the Fediverse? Because we're coming from Twitter, so we're going to be using a Mastodon server to connect to the Fediverse. All right. We got all of that out of the way. So what does federated mean? It's like email. I was talking about that. Already went through that. So your identity is username at instance name. You have to give that full tuple of information to somebody when you say, hey, follow me. You can't just say my identity is at Smitty or at Smitty Halibut. You have to give them the full thing of I am at Smitty at halibut.com or at KJ6VU at mastodon.radio, whatever your identity is. That whole thing is your identity. Okay, so how is it like Twitter? It's very much like Twitter in that you've got these short posts. Typically, it's 500 characters, although that limit is configurable by the server owner, the instance owner. But typically, it's about 500 characters. Kind of like on Twitter, it started out on 140, and now it's 280. Mastodon kind of defaults to 500. But you have these short posts that you can just throw a thought in, maybe attach some pictures or a video or something to, and you hit publish. And that can go out, that if assuming it's a public post, and we're gonna hand wave at private and direct messages and stuff like that, because that just adds complexity to the discussion. So right now I'm going to be concentrating on public posting. You post that and it shows up to anybody who is following you in their home timeline. Similarly, if you follow other people, whatever they post publicly will show up in your home timeline, right? So in that regard, it is very similar to Twitter. How is it different than Twitter? How is it not like Twitter? Mastodon also has the concept of a local timeline. This is different than home. Home is all the people that you follow explicitly, and they could be on your same instance or on a different instance. The local timeline is all the public posts of people on your instance, whether you follow them or not. And this is the key differentiator between Mastodon and Twitter. Because of that local timeline, there is some value to choosing which instance you create an account on. Like with email, it doesn't matter whether I'm on Gmail or Halibut or anything else, right? You choose your instance based on, the features that they provide you, but it doesn't matter who you're emailing with, who you want to email with. You can be on any server and email with anybody on any other server. And that is true for the home timeline on Mastodon. But with the local timeline, there is some value to deciding to choose a specific instance based on the community on that instance. And that's why we have things like mastodon.radio. The benefits to creating your own account on mastodon.radio, or the one that I just stood up to try and share some load with mastodon.radio, which is mastodon.hams.social. And if you're looking to go create an account, I recommend hams.social because it's got much lighter load at this point. Radio's been around a lot longer. But if you go and create an account on hams.social, the big advantage to doing that is that there are likely to be a bunch of other hams on hams.social. And if you go to your local timeline, you will see public posts from people you don't follow who are on that instance. And so if you're trying to find somebody that you want to follow, you're looking for public content that you want to start following. It's like you look at the local timeline and hey, that guy is posting some pretty cool stuff, or that gal is working on a really neat project, or whatever it is. You can see those without having to know who they are because they just show up. And then you can decide to follow them, and then they'll show up in your home timeline. So that is a difference to Twitter, because there is no concept of an instance. There's no concept of a community. Like they tried to build that with circles and communities and things, but it never really took off. It's inherent in the federated nature of the Fediverse. The people on your instance are sometimes, if that instance is targeted at a community, like the hams.social instance is, or the mastodon.radio instance is, then your local timeline will show a lot of really good content like that. There is a third timeline that's called federated. And the federated timeline is like a fire hose. It is every single public post that your instance has ever seen, whether it was posted by somebody on that instance, which is what the local timeline is, or is a public post that somebody on your instance follows. So if somebody on your instance follows somebody on a different instance, they post something publicly and it shows up into this person's local timeline, that post will also show up in your federated timeline, because now the instance that you're on has seen that post from some other server, some other instance, because one person on your instance followed that other person. That will show up in your federated timeline. So federated is everything that my instance has ever seen, whether it originates from my instance or not. Local is everything that originates from my instance. And then the home is everything that I have explicitly followed. And there are neat little graphs or kind of flowcharts that show how to figure out whether a post is going to show up in a timeline that you can see or not. And I'll find a link to that. I should have brought that up before doing this so I could screen share it. And that will that it does a really good job of explaining whether you will see a post or not and which timeline it'll show up in. All right, and then there's one other key feature that is caused by the federation, and that is search. Your instance, the instance that you are logged into, only knows about the content that it has seen. And when I say seen, I mean that has originated on your instance because the user who wrote that content is using that instance, or somebody on your instance follows a person on a different instance, and all of that public content comes into the server, basically the federated timeline, right? Because your server, your instance, only knows about the traffic it's seen, when you do a search, it will only search the content that your instance has seen. It cannot know about content that's on some other instance. If there's nobody on your server that follows another person, I'm getting all kinds of boop, boop, boops. I think it's, I don't know where it's coming from. Anyway, if there's nobody on your server follows a person on a different server and that content never made it onto this server because nobody follows that content, then when you search for that content here, your server, your instance doesn't know about it, and it will not show up in your search results, which is kind of a bummer in my opinion, but there are ways of dealing with that. And I'm going to get a little bit into the backend server technology here. If this makes your eyes glaze over, it's fine. I'm going to hand wave and say that your server admin can do things that improve that searchability. And that's called a relay. ActivityPub protocol allows for what's called a relay, and basically an instance subscribes to a relay, and all of its public content will get pushed to that relay and say, hey, relay, this is all of my content. And then another instance will subscribe to that relay and push all of their public content to that relay. And then that relay's job is to turn around and push all the content that it receives from all the instances out to all the other instances. And that content will show up in the other instances' federated timelines and is therefore searchable. The reason I'm bringing this up is because we have a relay set up between Mastodon.radio and hams.social. Unfortunately, it does not combine the local timelines. So if you're looking at a local timeline on Mastodon.radio, you will still see the content that is created on that timeline, but you are on that instance, but you will not see the local content that is created on this instance, not in the local timelines. The local timelines are still separate across those instances, but we are relaying our federated timelines. So that combines the federated timelines. You will be able to see content from this instance on this instance, whether you're following that person or not. And that also allows it to be searchable. So if you log into hams.social and you're looking for a particular call sign, if you search for that call sign on hams.social and that call sign exists on hams.radio, and they've ever posted publicly. Actually, I think it also pushes user account names. So if it's in the account name, then it will search across and be able to see content on that other server. So it's a way of dealing with the fact that we have split our community across multiple instances. We've got hams on .radio and we've got hams on hams.social. And the big advantage of the local timeline is that you can see content from other hams, whether you follow them or not. And by splitting it out into multiple instances, we kind of, we've splintered that community, unfortunately. By hooking up a relay between those instances, it doesn't recombine the local timeline, but it does at least make it searchable across. And that's the best we can do with the technology that we have right now. I've filed a ticket against the Mastodon server authors asking for a way to merge local timelines. And it looks like it's gotten some traction from other server admins as well. It sounds like a fair number of server admins want this kind of functionality, but it doesn't exist yet. All right, so what is it I've covered? It looks and feels like Twitter. Your identity is federated, which means it's user at server. Your home timeline consists of all the content that you follow directly. That's the one that's most like Twitter. Your local timeline is all the public content from people on your instance. And then the federated timeline is all the public content from people on your instance and everybody that those people on your instance follow, whether they're on your instance or not. And then the search only searches across the federated content. I think those are the main points that I wanted to make. Does anybody have any questions? Crickets?
Some of you may find that you're muted, so double check.
Yeah, Mark.
Yes, sir.
I just came in a bit late on this, but so what is the acceptance or use of Fediverse in 2022? I mean, I understand it's the basis for Truth Social, but beyond that, what else is?
Oh gosh, Truth is using Mastodon?
Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. Truth Social is part of the metaverse or Fediverse.
Fediverse, yeah. Metaverse is different. That's Facebook.
Yeah.
Yeah, Fediverse. So that's lovely. I didn't know that. Okay. That the answer to that question is changing hour by hour. Over the last week, a lot of people are fleeing Twitter in flocks, shall we say. You might actually argue that they're fleeing in murders. Basically the Fediverse is gaining like hundreds of thousands of users a day at this point. Like, so the numbers are changing very rapidly. I don't have the numbers right at hand, but I see graphs posted, come across my timeline periodically, and it's like just kind of creeping along, and then like over the last week, and it's just like this giant hockey stick of a graph. So obviously, or not, maybe not obviously, but not surprisingly, it has been adopted primarily by tech savvy communities and early adopter type communities, right? So there's a lot of ham radio activity on Mastodon right now, or on the Fediverse right now. There's a lot of kind of software developer and the hacker community, right? DEF CON has stood up their own instance. There's InfoSec Exchange. They're my favorite name, Hackiodon.io. It's like Hackaderm.io. Instead of pachyderm, like an elephant, it's hackaderm. Anyway, so that's another kind of hacker instance. To my disappointment, there has not been a lot of uptake by the motorsports community. I follow a lot of F1 content on Twitter, and that's not over there yet. So like I'm still kind of got one foot in each instance at this point, but it is getting better. More and more celebrities are showing up, more and more news outlets are showing up. That
So for Fediverse is under the hood,
Yes.
and people would be attracted to equivalents of Twitter, Facebook, whatever, that were either blogging or microblogging or messaging or whatever. So are there any sort of big ones, like when you say people are leaving Twitter in whatever they're leaving,
Flocks, whatever collective noun, yeah.
They would want to go somewhere, but it wouldn't be Fediverse. It would be something that was part of Fediverse.
A server.
Yeah, so you choose an instance to be on the Fediverse, but once you choose that instance, you get the entire Fediverse, right? You can follow anyone on any instance. So if you, as a ham radio operator, I would recommend hams.social, but that's totally up to you whether you follow that one. If you're on hams.social, you can still follow so-and-so at nasa.org or whatever instance name you want. So you can still follow anybody else on the network that you want. I have been hand waving at a lot of the benefits of the Fediverse and Mastodon specifically, in that there is a lot of really good moderation tools, and the instance owners get to implement their own rules about what is allowed and what is not allowed. Now, this can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, because places like truth.social get to say, yeah, sure, you can post whatever BS you want and we won't stop you. But it also means that me as an instance owner, I get to say, never talk to truth.social.
Yes.
It's a bunch of BS. I'm just going to block it at the server. And nobody on my instance, because I run my own private instance, will ever see any content from truth.social. I have the power to do that.
Okay, so this is one of the things I wanted to get at, is there's essentially a form of curation here. So first off, in the filtering, active filtering from certain sources, and correct me if I'm not understanding this correctly, but Mark, there's kind of an implied curation too by the community that you join. Because when I look at search in that second version of searching, then, for example, on hams.social, if I wanted ham related or stuff of interest to hams, that second level of search is what I would be using, correct?
I don't know what you mean by second level of search, but if you are on...
So there were three levels that you talked about.
So timelines.
Timelines,
so
yes.
There's home timeline, local timeline, and federated timeline. And when you do a search, it is inherently against federated.
Okay. So I could be searching on local timeline for people that were members of...
You wouldn't be searching on the local timeline. You'd just be viewing the timeline.
Viewing. Okay.
Yeah. So if you're viewing the timeline, you have a column up on your screen that's showing your local timeline. That will show all the public posts of people on your server. So you'll never get a post from anyone on truth.social in your local timeline. That is correct. Because the local timeline is only showing posts by accounts that are on your local instance.
Okay. And my other question was more of a best practice question.
Yes.
Which is, we sign up using what is essentially an email address. Are we?
It looks like one. I want to be careful
one.
calling it an email address, because it does not actually, like, if you send an email address to it, it's not going to deliver. There's no connection between ActivityPub and SMTP.
So it's not one more email to go with. And do I have to use the rod.hardman at hams.social in order to sign up with hams.social, or could it?
Yes.
Okay.
So
good.
rod.hardman as a username is going to be completely different on all of the instances that you use that username on. So rod.hardman at hams.social is a totally different identity, unconnected entirely from rod.hardman at mastodon.online. Right?
Okay. I'm just being cautious with spam.
Yep. Yeah. And think of it again, like email, right? If you had rod.hardman at Gmail versus rod.hardman at youremployer.com, those are entirely different email addresses. There is no connection between the two. unless you set up like forwarding or whatever, but there is no inherent connection between those two.
Okay. Any more recording questions?
Mark, just a question and a comment.
Yeah.
Historically, this reminds me of the days of BitNet in the sense that a lot of things are being engineered together. You know, one of the really positive things that's as much a theme of your talk as anything in specific is the social engineering elements of the thinking process that you talked about. I'm really impressed with that because that's the key. You know, BitNet was just putting the technology out there primarily at universities and research centers. And you'd have to call somebody up and say, hey, what's your BitNet address? Because I want to send you something. You know, gosh, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now you'd say, okay, what's your Twitter account? So I'll get your Mastodon account. And y'all are thinking through that. And let me clap hands and say bravo. The other thing that I would make an observation of is that many, I think, are leaving Twitter in the guise of creating a Mastodon account, but they're also keeping their Twitter account, at least for the time being. So that overlap is one thing that I don't think we know. I mean, you just don't have the data for that, but that's just an impression. Our friend Vinny D, for example, just put out a note on Twitter, which I follow him, and said, hey, I'm this at Mastodon, but he's not going away from Twitter, although he looks like he's hooking up all the plumbing to go back and forth, at least for a time being. So the last little thing is separating identities held by one entity. For instance, you're Mark Smith as a person, you're Smitty Halibut and Halibut Electronics as a company.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability, and I think you've pounded, you know, the spike in the railroad here well enough to say, hey, those are two different things. They will become, there's a tension to become one thing. Hence, I say something on my personal side that my employer doesn't like, you're still held accountable, et cetera. And that's an observation, Mark, as much as it's not a question or a criticism, it's just an observation. But really good thinking, I think, is going into this. So I applaud that.
Thank you. You were talking about Vince and how he's posted that he's not going away from Twitter just yet. He actually can't be here at this recording today, but he did send me several questions in email. So, Rod, you were saying, are there any more questions? I've got some here that I want to address from Vinny D, as Frank calls him. But I wanted to give people on the call a chance to ask their questions first. So, yes, there has been a lot of thought put into the social aspects of it and the moderation and the curation aspects of it. The software and protocols backing all of this have been in development for probably 10 years at this point. They've been around a long time. And not too surprisingly, they are written by people that are in several various different minority categories. There's a lot of LGBTQ people that are writing this, a few trans folks, just like a lot of minorities that have been like victimized over in Twitter. And they're like, forget this, I want a different place. And I'm going to go build a system that is resistant and resilient against the problems that caused Twitter to turn so toxic. And so they built those mechanisms into ActivityPub, into Mastodon, into PixelFed, specifically because they were victims in the single global community where they had very little control over the curation of what showed up in their timeline. So that is not an accident. Like, that was built in intentionally from the ground up. And I'm here for it. I love it. Yeah.
Hey, John asked, can a club have their own domain?
Yes, absolutely. So, question of instances and, you know, when do you have too many and when do you have too few and all that fun stuff? That is purely a social question. It's not hard to stand up an instance for somebody like me, because I've been doing this professionally for decades. There are hosting services that you can go to and pay $10 a month, and they will do the technical hosting for you, and you get your own domain of a running Mastodon instance, and you get to set your own rules, your own policies, your own blocks, your own curation, and your users get to use it, right? So there are solutions out there to address, both of those use cases. That gives you an identity on the metaverse, or on the Fediverse, great gravy, not metaverse, on the Fediverse, that you get to control, right? And so there might be some advantage to that, just like you might have an email address for your club. The problem with that is that you now have a very limited federated timeline. It's just the few people that are in your club and the people that they follow. So if you want it for primarily club interaction, you absolutely can do that. If you are then very good about following people on other instances, then that can work very well as well. Where it becomes a slightly problematic is that if you're not great about following other people and knowing who those people are to follow, and you rely on your local timeline or your federated timeline, then those timelines will be somewhat limited at that point, because that server doesn't have a lot of interaction out with the rest of the world. So in that case, it may be better to join a larger instance and then maybe use the club instance for announcements from the club. Not so much clubs, but journalism, or anytime you need a verified identity. One of the biggest advantages to Fediverse, in my opinion, all federated systems, is the fact that your identity is inherently verified if you're using the right domain name, right? So ActivityPub makes it very difficult / impossible. I hate saying impossible because hackers are really good at this, but it explicitly attempts to block identity spoofing. Email doesn't do this. For me, I can very easily send you an email that make it looks like it comes from jeff@amazon.com. That is very easy for me to spoof, right? Just at the protocol level, I can do it in 30 seconds. Fediverse blocks that. The authentication of the source identity is very strongly protected, which means that if you see a post from journalist name @wapo.com, you have a pretty good trust in the fact that that's actually coming from that journalist. You don't need a stupid blue check mark, right? The fact that the identity, the domain is part of that identity. And if you trust that domain to verify the user at that domain, i.e. Washington Post is going to do a really good job of making sure only their journalists get accounts on the wapo.com domain name, right? Then there's a very, very, very high trustability that that identity is correct. Similarly, halibut.com. I am at smitty@halibut.com. I'm not going to just give anybody an identity on my server. So if you see a post coming from smitty@halibut.com, there's a very good chance that it's actually me. Whereas if somebody creates smittyhalibut@mastodon.online, right, that looks like it's me, but that is a much harder thing to verify. So you're asked about clubs. One of the advantages of a club standing up its own domain is that you would be able to get that inherent verification of this is actually this club member at this club, or this member of this club, right? And maybe clubs, that's not quite as important, but there are a lot of cases where it would be very important.
Mark, follow-up question on that. Great point. Have you looked at what procedures these vendors who will, for whatever a month, will stand up an instance for you?
Mm-hmm.
Or how are they looking at potential customers? I mean, are they authenticating them? They're authenticating a payment source for sure.
Yeah.
But you see where I'm coming from there.
Yeah, I do. No, I have not looked at this at all, but just off the cuff, the customer is going to come to them with their own domain name. And so the customer has to be able to provide DNS for the new instance. And so if the customer has the ability to say mastodon.mydomain.com is now this IP address over at this hosting service. That's kind of inherent verification. Yep, you've got control over that domain name.
So it sounds like there's two factors there, not to be confused with 2FA, but two factors. You've got your domain authentication with the registry, and then you've got a payment source because you're going to have to pay them, right? Yeah,
but it's the hosting company. It's not their job to say, WAPO.com. If WAPO doesn't want to stand up their own instance, they pay a hosting company. I don't think it's their job to say WAPO.com is actually WAPO.com, because if WAPO.com was not the one setting that up, the DNS would never point at that server. Nobody would
got
ever...
it. Where I'm thinking of on your point about not absolute trust, but a high level of trust. Okay. All right.
That's just because I like hedging my bets, because I know hackers are really good.
And here's where I'm going at. So then this thing proliferates. Well, look at what happened with that other entity, Twitter. You had all kinds of folks getting accounts on Twitter, and there really wasn't a whole lot of authentication. So what I'm doing is saying, okay, let's see how Mastodon is screening for this. So it sounds like there's going to be two levels, because if something happens, you've got the domain registry, and then you got a payment registry. Right? I mean, it's because they're paying them somehow. So is it really Frank or Mark? I mean, that's a count. Anyway, I'm just thoughts. I'm just thinking out loud. You're causing all kinds of synapses to fire here, friend.
Yeah. DNS is the ultimate root of trust on the internet. Period, full stop. Now we're going off on a huge tangent. Like, this is not Mastodon Fediverse related. The DNS is the ultimate root of trust on the internet. Without DNS being trustworthy, nothing else is trustworthy. So if you are able to provide DNS for a given domain, it is assumed that you control that domain, because now you can point that domain name at any IP address you want, whether it's the actual server or somebody else's server. So the fact that you are able to point DNS for your mastodon.yourdomain.com to the server you want it to point at, that is inherently an anchor of trust. And then now you control that server, and you are now in charge of only allowing users that you believe and trust and are willing to vouch for user at that domain name. Like the user is up to you, the domain name is up to DNS, which is ultimately up to you, and stuff like that. So now we're getting into like the chain of trust. And
stuff. It is, and I will end with this, but note FCC late to the party now saying ISPs, you can't throw your hands up anymore and say the spammers are not your problem. We're making it your problem. Yeah. And there's a vague analogy, and we'll see where it goes. I mean, we're just thinking out loud today.
Yeah.
So Mark, everything I've heard you say has been sort of implied that governance is technical, right? So I want to just step back, because you're describing what's called the system of systems, and system of systems work for a number of reasons, but critical is interoperability and standards.
Yes.
Right. So what is the governance process for the system of systems to ensure that all the things you're talking about get reflected in interoperability and standards to enable all the kinds of behaviors you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't a technical issue. This is a governance issue. How is Fediverse governed?
So the protocol you're talking about, the standard you're talking about, is ActivityPub. And there are, I don't know the details. The short answer is I don't have a lot of details on this, but you're absolutely correct. And the protocol that underlies all of this connection of multiple systems is ActivityPub. And the source authentication in ActivityPub uses strong crypto, and I haven't looked at the details myself, so I don't know how strong it is, but a lot of hackers are on the Fediverse now, like hundreds of them, I don't want to say hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of hackers are on the Fediverse now. And I guarantee you there's enough of them looking at it that if there are problems, we will be finding out about it very soon. If we haven't already, right? There are probably already some fixes that have been put in place quietly. Who knows? So who is it that defines the ActivityPub protocol? I don't know the answer to that question. There are people, I know the people that write the software are involved in that.
It's not just a question of defining, it's a question of, this is very deep, but I mean, over the last few weeks, we've had a complete collapse in the virtual currency industry. It came about through a complete lack of transparency and competency and a complete lack of governance. And so, you know, one of the problems with the internet is that its initial governance was all technically based and nobody was able to deal with all the strange and bad things that happened thereafter. And so if we're creating a Fediverse to get around the centralized problems of systems that we're dealing with right now, we're just going to go down the same route unless there's some way of governing it. And I don't mean top-down governance, although that's one form of governance. I mean, your vision is very compelling, but a lot of compelling visions turn to non-compelling ones. Anyway, that's enough on that. But it's something. It's not a technical problem; it's a behavioral problem, and that's where these things usually fall apart, right?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. Except that I do know that people that have created it are well motivated for it to be a well curated and well protected environment because of their history. And they are incredibly technically inclined people, which you say it wasn't a technical problem. I'm not sure I agree with that, because the early internet was created assuming an awful lot of trust, and that trust is what evaporated and caused all the problems. You can argue that they should have been thinking about trust, but they were just concentrating on whether they could get it to work in the first place.
Yeah, right? It was the homogeneity of those early people, Mark. It was the homogeneity because they were of a like mind. They were primarily computer-centered folks. Yeah. Once it expanded, you had heterogeneity. That's when, and then commercialization. Anyway, yeah. I'm in agreement with you.
So let's not forget the heavy hand of the government in the early stages of the internet. As an early participant, completely underwritten by federal contracts, right? So this was more than altruism, more than research. There was a directed sense of the need for this decentralized network infrastructure, and it was highly curated and supported with tens of millions of dollars at the time to bring that into fruition. This is really different, right? Because this is really more peer-to-peer, based on kind of I would say a higher calling than what brought about the internet, just kind of my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay. Did we get Vince's questions in?
Let me read them. In my day-to-day interactions with others, how is it similar to the bird site and how is it different? I tried to put that into my notes. The home timeline is very similar to Twitter. The local and federated and search are how it's different. Beyond local server rules, do I really care which server my account is on and why? So local server rules, the community standards are going to vary. Hams.social and Mastodon.radio have very different server rules and community standards than Truth.social does, right? So much so that we block Truth.social. Or if we don't yet, we will soon. Right. So the server rules are definitely a difference. Other than that, do you really care which server your account is on? Only for the local timeline. You get the inherent benefit of a way to view a community based on your local timeline, what instance you're on. Other than that, no, because you can explicitly follow anyone else on any other instance, assuming they haven't blocked you for whatever reason, right? Like I'm hand waving at blocks and curation. All of that will obviously get in the way of this, but assuming that's not a problem, you can follow any user on any other site. So it does not matter what instance you're on. For example, I've stood up my own halibut.com, right? I don't get a local timeline from Mastodon.radio or Hams.social, but I'm still incredibly active because I've made made it a pretty good important factor of my presence there to follow people on other servers. Can I engage with people as I do on the bird site? Engage with people? Yeah, absolutely. You still have public posts. You can do direct messages. You can do, private posts to just people that follow you. All of those kinds of mechanisms are still there. And I use the bird site as a push for sharing information as much as for interacting with others. Will I have the same experience for Mastodon? Yes. And so for the push mechanism, meaning it's as a kind of a broadcast, right? You just posted on your bird site, or excuse me, on your timeline. And then the trick is to get other people to follow you. And if that's the same trick on Twitter, right? How do you get people to follow you? Well, you post useful information and make sure that at least a few people see it, and then they will turn around. And on Twitter, it's retweeting. On Mastodon, it's called boosting. But it's the same thing. You boost a post and it shows up in your timeline, and anybody that follows you will now see that post. All right, I use Twitter as we already talked about that, and a comment. I don't care about the decentralized server stuff. I just want to use a social media part. What are the benefits for me? Like all the things that we've talked about, the curation and whatnot. If you're not a I don't know, purist like I am, I feel very strongly about federation and distributed servers. I believe it is absolutely the right way to go, which is why I got into it so early and I've stood up my own instances. I understand that most people are not that adamant about that, and that's totally fine. What are the benefits to you? The main benefit is community. Where are the people, right? And if Twitter is disappearing, if people are leaving Twitter in droves, the people that are going to be left behind on Twitter are the people who are not going to be concerned about what's happening on Twitter. You get to choose whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's totally up to you. For me personally, I don't make any secrets about where my opinions lay. And the people that are moving to Mastodon are the people that I'm far more interested in following and interacting with. So for me, the community is moving over to Mastodon, and that's where I want to be.
Okay.
So Mark, a question about, so like anybody can set up their own server and so on and so forth.
Correct.
How do we deal with sort of that fragmentation now of the community where, 100,000 hams and, 10,000 on this one, 10,000 on that one.
Mm-hmm.
And now, unless you know somebody who's on another one and you sort of build this whole web, like where do you start by, trying to find and join one of the broader communities as opposed to all these little tiny pockets of.
Correct. Yeah. And it's not much different than it is on Twitter, right? You still need to know the person's Twitter handle to be able to follow them. And you still need to know their Mastodon identity or the Fediverse identity to be able to follow them. So how do you find those identities? Well, one way is people like us, we broadcast in podcasts and YouTube channels and whatnot. Find me on the Fediverse at smitty@halibut.com. And then if you're listening to that podcast, you'll say, oh, hey, look, maybe I want to check this out. And you follow Smitty. Now it's on me. And I encourage all of the rest of you to do the same thing, to start boosting other content. Boost is like retweet, right? Because now you, Dan, have just joined the Fediverse and you're not following very many people at all, but you follow me. I follow a lot of people and I'm looking at a lot of really interesting content, and I find a piece of content that I'm like, this is really cool. I will boost it. And even if that post was from Rod Hardman, let's say Rod posts some really cool content. Oh yeah. And I'm like, you know what? That's rad. Boost. Now Rod's post, even though you don't follow him, Dan, it will show up in your timeline because I have boosted it. Okay. So, that is one way that you will start seeing other content. And then you say, hey, that was actually a pretty cool post from Rod. Let me follow Rod. And then Rod's content starts showing up in your timeline and the things that he boosts, right? So it's this organic growth of neat content that are posted by people that you don't yet follow, but have been boosted by people you do follow.
Okay.
And that's the organic way to do it if you're on your own standalone instance. The local timeline can bootstrap that process, right? Because the local timeline is all the public posts by people, whether you follow them or not. And so if you're on an instance, 100,000 hams, you're on an instance that only has 10,000 hams. So you're only seeing 10% of the total content in your local timeline, but you can at least see that 10% and start following them, and then their boosts and their boosts and their boosts, right? So it's to help other people find content. It is really important to boost the content that you think other people will be interested in, because you're right, it is a problem. It is a problem. On Twitter, the answer to that problem, the question was that Twitter has an algorithm, and they will occasionally throw things at you, whether you want it or not. And they try to do it as content they think you're going to be interested in. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail, right? There's no such algorithm. There is zero algorithm anywhere on the Fediverse. There is nobody curating this content and collecting it all and saying, this is the popular one, therefore I think more people should see it, right? The only people that are doing that are the users themselves when they boost a post, right? Okay. So whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's a philosophical discussion that I will leave to the reader. I personally think it's a good thing because I can follow freely and say, oh, that looks interesting, follow. And then a few posts in, I'm like, you know what? Not that interesting, unfollow. It's no big deal, right? Somebody's posts that are showing up on my timeline that I don't follow and I really don't like those posts, block that user. Not the one that's doing the boosting, but the content that I don't like. You can block that user and say, I just don't ever want to see content from this user ever, period, full stop. I can block that user. If it's a domain name that seems to be infested with a lot of users that I don't like, as an individual user, you can say, block that domain. I don't want it. Nothing from that domain will ever get to my timelines, any of them. Even if it was sent directly to me, it won't show up, right? And then the server admin also has the ability to say, block that individual user or block that entire instance. So those curation mechanisms are there.
Yeah, I just add a couple of things, right? So first of all, every Mastodon server has a profiles directory. You can click on that and see both people local to that server as well as on the federated Mastodon verse, however we describe that, right?
Yeah.
The second thing, and so I just experienced, so I started out on Mastodon.radio and definitely got the vibe. It's a more European centered home for radio. It's a server's based in the EU somewhere.
UK.
And so I just moved over to Mark's server. And when I did that, it was really fascinating because all of a sudden, and I put out an introduction on Mark's server, I got all these follows.
Hams.social. Please don't say it's my server because it is a community server. We've got two other admins as well. I provide the infrastructure, but that's it.
Yeah, as the administrator, I give you authorship. But it's
a community server.
Fair enough. But the interesting side effect of that was a whole bunch of people on Mastodon.radio just followed me because I made a post, right? It's the first post in a few months. And so I think that's part of the effect as well. Like, you know, Dan, I think if you put out a single intro, that message gets propagated not only to the local server, but to these other servers, right? So so it's interesting kind of the virality of this.
Yeah.
Even when compared to Twitter. And by the way, this morning, I hate to say this, Elon Musk put out a survey asking Twitter users if they wanted the orange one back on Twitter. And so my days on Twitter are probably marked in a number of days at this stage.
I intentionally don't want to cover the current events right now because that'll bring up lots of things, but people are leaving Twitter very quickly.
So speaking of the next,
hang on, I want to address two different things. Sorry for interrupting, Rod. There are two things there that I wanted to bring up. One is hashtags. When you do a search on Mastodon, it will only return search results for hashtags. So make heavy use of hashtags in your posts if you want other people to find your content. This also means that you kind of have to learn the conventions of what hashtags are in use. Like hashtag introduction singular is where most people post their introduction posts. And if you do a search for introduction because you're looking for new people and you search for introduction, you'll see all the posts that have hashtag introduction in there. So that's a very good way to find new people. The second thing you talked about, JR, is you moved your account. That is something that's very important, in my opinion. They have nailed this, in my opinion, with one possible exception. If you create an account on one instance and you're like, you know what, I want to be on this instance instead, there's a relatively simple process you can go through that will move your social web with you. So when you go through this process, everybody that you follow, you will automatically follow on your new instance. And everybody who follows you will automatically follow you on your new instance. So you move your entire social web with you over to your new account. The one thing that does not move is your post history, because your post history is inherently username @server, and that server, so all your posts stay with that server. If they tried to move all of that, all the links would break and it would be a mess. It's best for those posts to stay on the old server. And as long as that server is there and they're not trimming old content, they'll still be there in perpetuity. But it does mean that the server admin has the option of deleting those posts at some point in the future if they want to. But your new timeline over on the new server will be empty. It doesn't have all of your historic posts. So that's kind of like the one bummer, but it's a conscious decision and they did it on purpose for good reasons, but it is a bummer. But your social web moves with you over to the new instance.
Okay.
Okay.
So I was going to do two things here. One is I want to ask about next steps, and then I'm going to kind of wind up the recording session for this. So question for you, Mark.
Yes.
In terms of next actions, especially for people that are watching this that may have heard of Mastodon, may have heard of the Fediverse, hey, what do I do next? So, and I'll focus this, you can do a generic comment, but also focus it on people interested in amateur radio.
Okay. So assuming you're primarily interested in amateur radio and you want to choose an amateur radio community to join for your local timeline, then my recommendation would be to go to mastodon.hams.social. And I will tell you that Mastodon is spelled with an O, Mastodon. I am ashamed to admit how long it took me to figure this out. When I was first setting up halibut.com, it was Mastodon, not Mastodon, for a very long time. And I ended up blowing away that server and fixing it before I went live. Anyway, mastodon.hams.social. Go to that webpage and it will present you with a, would you like to sign up, log in or register an account, and you go in and register an account. Once you register an account, my preference, and this is in the instance rules, is that you use your call sign as your name, but you don't have to. Some people are interested in radio and don't have call signs, or they don't want their call sign out there because it's too easy to look it up in a database and dox yourself, basically. So if you don't want to use your call sign, that's okay. Or if you've got an identity elsewhere that is not your call sign, that's okay. But if you are willing, please use your call sign. You create an account, do the email verification step. That is important. We cannot approve you until that has happened. And then we will look at the accounts and we will click approve, assuming, you're not a spammer or whatever. So we go through this, me and two other guys, K2ZA, John, and I think it's VE6 TCP. VE is Australia, right?
No, VE6 is Alberta.
Is Alberta. Okay, no, then VK6. I always get the Alberta and Australia mixed up. So VK6 TCP, Alan, John, and I are the three admins of the hams.social site. One of us will get to it. We'll look at it and say, yep, you look like a ham. Read the rules. I will encourage everybody to read the rules. There is a very specific reason why I want you to read the rules, and only about half people are doing it. read the rules and then set up an account. And then once we approve it, you can log in and, whoever approves your account, one of the 3 admins of us will post everybody please welcome, here's a new account. And then we will ask you to post an introduction post, include hashtag introduction, and tell us a little bit about yourself. And, then start looking at the local timeline. You might get people automatically following you because of that introduction post that us admins have posted. And start interacting, start following other people. When you see content you like, boost it. When you see content from people that you're not following that you like, follow them, and get the web going. Excellent.
Okay, well, with that in mind, I will thank Mark for doing an amazing introduction to this. I learned a lot. Hopefully you all did too. For people that find these recordings, you may have found us and not know anything about Cycle 25. Well, we do post on YouTube at /Cycle25, all sorts of interesting talks. So yeah, come back. Be sure to like and subscribe, as they say.
As the kids say.
I think that's the first time I've ever said that. Imagine that. Okay, well, thank you, folks. I'm going to end the recording now, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Cheers.